I get a lot of messages from folks who love the classic synth vibe but aren't sure whether a vintage-styled analog board is worth the desk space and price tag. The decision usually comes down to 3 questions. Will it actually fit into the workflow I already have? Does it give me something I can't get from a software plugin? And will I end up regretting the spend if the sound isn't as usable as the hype suggests? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this review I'm going to walk through those exact concerns, pull apart how the Prophet 5 behaves when you plug it into a real studio, and help you decide if the analog charm it promises is the right match for your music-making needs. First off, the Prophet 5 is marketed as a revival of the original 1970s instrument that helped shape early electronic pop. What that means in practice is a 61-key keyboard that runs 5 fully analog voices simultaneously. You don't get an endless polyphony stack, but the 5-voice limit actually forces you to think about arrangement in a way that can keep a track from getting overly dense. If you're used to stacking dozens of synth layers in a DAW, you'll notice that you have to be more selective about what you let ring out at once. In day-to-day use, that constraint can be a blessing. When I was layering pads for a chill-out track, the 5-voice limit nudged me toward a tighter chord voicing that sounded less muddy, and the analog circuitry gave those chords a warmth that a digital emulator struggled to replicate. Now, let's talk about the Hanson experience. The keyboard feels solid enough for both studio sessions and live gigs. The key travel is a little heavier than a synth action piano, which is typical for analog gear, and that gives each note a bit of weight that some players find encourages better finger control. When you fire up the oscillator section, you immediately hear the classic fat waveform that Sequential is famous for. The filter section is where the magic happens. The low-pass resonance can be dialed in to create that signature sweeping sound you hear in classic 80s tracks, but it's also surprisingly smooth for modern production. In a recent mix I was working on, the filter's ability to move from subtle warmth to a more aggressive, biting tone allowed me to replace a handful of digital synth plugins with a single Prophet 5 patch, saving CPU and keeping the mix more cohesive. Connectivity is another practical aspect that often trips people up with older style synths. The Prophet 5 includes MIDI in, out, and through, plus a USB port that can handle both MIDI and audio streaming. I set it up in a hybrid rig where the synth handles the core sound generation, then routes the audio straight into my DAW over USB. The latency is negligible, which means you can record a performance in real time without the timing wobble that sometimes shows up with older USB-MIDI converters. For those who still prefer traditional cables, the 5-pin MIDI works flawlessly with any external sequencer, and the CV outputs give you the option to sync with modular gear if you ever want to expand your setup beyond the keyboard. Where the Prophet 5 really shines is in the tonal character that you can't exactly program into a software synth. The analog oscillators have a slight drift that adds a living, breathing quality to sustained notes, something I heard clearly when layering a lead over a drum loop. In a live setting, that drift becomes an organic texture that makes the performance feel less sterile. I also tested the patch memory, which holds 100 user-created sounds. It's enough to keep a setlist varied without having to constantly dive into menus, yet you still have direct access to the knobs for on-the-fly tweaking. That kind of immediacy is what a lot of producers say they miss when they rely solely on screen-based editing. That said, there are a few trade-offs you should weigh before hitting the checkout. Because it's an analog engine, the Prophet 5 does not have the deep modulation matrix you find in some high-end digital synths. If your workflow relies on routing dozens of LFOs and envelopes to multiple parameters, you'll find the routing options a bit limited. The unit also lacks a built-in sequencer, which means you'll need an external device or DAW to handle pattern-based parts. For a bedroom producer who wants a one-stop shop for arpeggios and step sequencing, that could be a deal-breaker. Additionally, the price point sits higher than many software alternatives, so the value proposition really hinges on how much you value the analog sound and Hanson control versus the convenience of a plugin. Who should buy this? If you're a musician who spends a lot of time crafting synth leads, pads, or basses and you appreciate the tactile experience of turning knobs while you play, the Prophet 5 gives you a distinct sonic fingerprint that's hard to emulate. It also makes sense for live performers who need a reliable, instantly accessible sound source that can stand up to stage rigging without a laptop in the mix. On the flip side, if you're a